Hello, listeners. Welcome to Media Coffee, a podcast series hosted by Cision. I'm your host, Nathan, and in this series, we'll be interviewing journalists from leading media organizations and big markets to answer some of our clients' top questions on how to communicate with the media. In this episode, we are excited to have a special guest, John Jannarone, founder and editor of CorpGov. A Princeton graduate with an illustrious career spanning investment banking and esteemed media outlets like the Wall Street Journal and CNBC. John brings a wealth of knowledge. He also founded Capital Markets Media LLC, shaping platforms, like CorpGov and other sites such as IPO Edge and Exec Edge, delivering insightful business and financial news. Today, he will be providing valuable insights for companies looking to pitch their ESG or social and governance focused stories. As a global provider of earned media software and services, Cision aims to equip PR agencies and communications professionals with the tools and knowledge they need to succeed. We believe that understanding the media industry and building strong relationships with journalists is crucial for effective communication strategies. If you're curious to learn more about Cision and how we can assist you in enhancing your PR efforts, please visit our website, email us, or follow us on social media accounts for the latest news and updates. Well, John, I want to thank you for being a guest on today's episode. Let's start out by informing the listeners more about yourself and your transition from working to finance to being the founder of a media company and an editor.
Great, Nathan. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. We work with Cision. They help us out with press releases quite a bit, and I'm a big fan. Nathan, so just quickly, you gave me a great introduction there, but a quick one is that I started out in Wall Street investment banking and quickly pivoted over to the Wall Street Journal and later CNBC. I just became very interested in financial news content and analysis rather than cranking out spreadsheets all the time.
Yes.
So I spent about 10 years between those two places in Singapore, New York, and London. And then 6 years ago, almost, I founded Capital Markets Media, which, as you mentioned, is the owner, the parent of CorpGov, which is corpgov.com, IPO Edge, and Exec Edge. CorpGov is the focus here today. But when I launched this company, I did so in part reactively because I felt that I was in newsrooms where I was asked to write a lot of content that I was losing interest in gradually, and corporate governance, activism, and IPOs, one of our other big verticals, have always been something I've been very interested in. So we do written content, which is all earned. We host video events kind of like this, and we host annually a CorpGov forum in Palm Beach. That's on November 8th. And I urge anyone who wants to learn more about that, just go to corpgov.com and you can see that right there. So that's my story. But I should also say, Nathan, that I've seen ESG and corporate governance, which is a big part of ESG. It's the G. Since I was in college, I've been following this, and I can tell you a lot about the evolution I've seen. But I'll let you go ahead and ask some questions. Maybe we'll tease that out naturally.
Yeah, sure. I'll definitely follow up with that towards the end of the interview. But thank you for sharing that with the listeners, and we'll go ahead and get started with the questions. I want to start out by asking you about you and your publication's attitude towards ESG press releases, or just press releases in general.
Great. So, I think that this gets back to my career once again that I've observed is that there was a time when even smaller companies would put a press release out and it would get attention from the media. It's gotten a lot harder. And part of the reason for anyone who's been watching in the last, 15 or 20 years is that these newsroom floors are shrinking. There just aren't as many people to do this stuff. There's talk about doing it with ChatGPT and generative AI, but
Yes.
the reality is that press releases are not typically something that prompt a reporter to write a story, but it's a part of a mosaic, I would say. And when you're thinking about journalists, try to think about how the journalists think. We try to think from the perspective of investors and companies. And so when I see news come out in a press release, I'm going to pay attention to it if it looks more thoughtful. Saying we've produced an ESG report like thousands of other companies have, and go check it out, is not really the way to do it. I think that your communication needs to be more holistic and thoughtful. So the kinds of words you're putting into that release and the things that you're emphasizing, whatever it is that your company takes most seriously and is most focused on, that should be woven into your communication across the board, be it to the investment community, journalists, or other stakeholders in your world. And so that's why I'd like to just frame press releases in that way, because a press release is a tool of communication, not necessarily to reach me as a journalist, but ultimately you're trying to get the attention of investors and other parties, who care about your business.
Yes, of course. Yes. Could you shed light on how you and your publication generate ideas for ESG focused stories and articles?
Yeah, so normally what happens, and I think that I'm similar to a lot of journalists out there, is you'll just be doing some reporting. You'll be gathering string on something, trying to figure out what's going on because you took interest in it, and someone will tell you about something unusual that's happening. Now, most journalists, Nathan, when it comes to this stuff, are probably focused on the activism side. So think of either a company being criticized for not having a robust enough policy on the environment. Go back to Exxon, for instance, with engine number one. Or it's going to be when a company is what you call greenwashing. So companies will get accused of trying to look like they have, and that's more on the E environment for ESG. They're trying to paint themselves as advocates of the environment or whatever it is, some kind of social responsibility, but in reality, there's no meat on the bone. It's all words. And so that's when companies can get the most attention. But I also think that, and this is the kind of thing that we discuss when we have panels, or we will again at our conference, there's a thoughtful conversation to be had about the right messaging around ESG. I remember we had a group of panelists, and it was a women in finance panel. And we asked them what they thought about diversity, and they didn't really want to talk about having more women. What they talked about was having thought diversity and background diversity. So, even putting women on here who stand to benefit from the addition of women that more closely reflects, the balance of our population, they're going further than that. I mean, that's a little bit too simple for them. They want to know what is this company doing that incorporates some of these tenets of ESG, whichever letter it is, into their broader strategy. What are they doing to make it a better business? And that gets back to a big question, Nathan, is we can talk about what's best for shareholders, and in most cases the answer to that's pretty easy. It's the stock price performance, right? But I think that there is still a lot more thought going on now, even if the ESG emphasis has waned a little bit on being holistic and thinking about all of your stakeholders. So I think that's part of how the storytelling has to work.
Yes, that was very insightful, John. Thank you for sharing that. I definitely agree with that. Um, Next, we'll move on to the next set of questions, which is about the perception and preferences of ESG press releases. Um, uh, in terms of receiving press releases, could you describe your preferences for receiving them? Would it be email or somebody picking up the phone and calling you?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing for something like that, again, because the press release in itself around, unless there's some huge change you're making, is not an announcement that's necessarily going to trigger a flurry of news stories. So I think that sending them by email is probably the least intrusive way.
Okay.
And Nathan, I'm not going to say that we ignore these press releases by any stretch of the imagination. It's interesting to see how companies are coming at it from different angles, but I think that's probably the best way. And then, of course, this should be obvious, Nathan, but and this isn't just for things like ESG. If there's
Yes.
something important like that, make it easy to find on your investor website. Sometimes stuff is just not, it shouldn't
Yes.
be buried in your SEC filings. You shouldn't have to go to Edgar. It should be, front and center. Because a lot of journalists actually don't like being on mailing lists, so to minimize their email traffic. So it's put it somewhere easy to find when someone wants to get it.
Yes. Got it. Um, what elements within a press release catch your attention specifically? And additionally, do you prefer the length, format, and critical components like images, videos, and links, and contact details?
Yeah, I think all those are good. It's funny you mentioned that about video. I hadn't thought of that till you asked me now, but we live in an increasingly video oriented world. I mean, I come from a print background, but I, did some television work, and we found that our viewers love video content. I like to read stuff personally, but I guess I'm not normal. So I think that
Yeah.
working in multimedia is smart. And you know what I would say is rather than say we believe in ESG, we embrace it, et cetera. If you've got something tangible to talk about, like, oh, we just, you know, cut our use of fossil fuels by 90%, or, and this one can be tricky too. I'm sure that you've seen stories about this, this net zero stuff. You can buy
Yes.
carbon credits even if you're a polluter. So that doesn't really work that well either. But if you're actually taking concrete steps and there's something tangible to point to, that's what you want in there, because anyone can say I support ESG and social equality, environmental protection, and good
Yes.
governance, but doing things, and if I can, I want to split up these three letters really quickly here, Nathan, in terms of which of them is
Mhm.
most important. Something that I've heard through this ESG cycle, let's call it, since it came into vogue about 5 years ago. I mean, at the time when it first started, I remember being at a conference we hosted with NASDAQ, the first CorpGov forum, almost 4 years ago. And there were some activists and others up there saying, I don't think that E and S are really ever going to be that important. And the G always has been, always will. For a while there was a tremendous amount of attention on the E and the S. That's pulled back. But what I would say is, in order to, I mean, I just talked to a few folks this morning ahead of this podcast to do a little reporting for you, Nathan. I
Yes.
mean, a couple of them said we don't care about ESG, but a couple of them did say, well, even those folks said, it's not important to them. They know it's a big deal. But even the people who do care about it, they said, look, I was talking to an activist, and he said, when I launched a campaign, this was a company doing environmentally dirty things. He didn't even make it part of his campaign because it wasn't something he could tie closely enough to shareholder returns. The G you can. So what I would say, long-winded, so forgive me for being roundabout here, Nathan, if you're going to talk about ESG, I would put a lot of emphasis on the G material, even if you love your E and S stuff, because everybody wants to hear that. If you're talking
Yeah.
about, mandatory retirement, that kind of thing, if you're saying we have board directors who've been on the board 30 years and we're getting rid of them, and we're going to set term limits, that kind of stuff, that has an effect. And in fact, a journalist who's writing about governance or activism is much more likely to go for that than to say we're net zero.
Yes, yeah, that was very insightful. Um, to follow up with that, how important is the language used in the press releases? For example, uh, would you prefer American English over British or Australian English, or does that not matter?
I don't think that's a big deal either way. I've had British
Okay.
bosses whose spelling I had to correct after they edited my work. Um, no, I don't think that's a big deal. But in
Mhm.
terms of language, Nathan, I would say, getting back to what I was saying before, if you're going to emphasize certain things and you're using terms or phrases, keep
Yes.
hammering away with those. Use them everywhere and keep them similar so that people get, what's important to you. But I wouldn't worry too much about regional dialects or anything like that.
Okay, got it. Um, Lastly, I'll ask you a follow-up question with the ESG preferences. Um, what is your fact-checking process for ESG press releases?
Well, it takes a lot of work to fact check everything, but what I would say is that you'll get you'll get communication between a press release and what's in an SEC filing, for instance, because oftentimes there's a communication going in parallel, and I think lawyers generally try to make those consistent, but that's really important because good journalists, in my experience, love to go dig up primary material that's required by regulators such as SEC filings rather than PR speak content.
Yes.
I mean, just think about what happens if you send a press release. The article, if one's written, is not going to look much like it, right? There's going to be certain language taken out, but so that's what I would say is just keep it consistent. But I don't think that most journalists are really in a position, unless the company is really shady already, to go and
Yeah.
fact check everything.
Yeah.
So that's what I'd say.
Okay, got it, got it. Let's move along. I want to ask you some questions about crafting a press release. From your experience, what advice would you offer to authors of ESG press releases?
I think that for any press release, the rule of thumb is probably to go and look at other ones that you thought were done well, and try to figure out what about them was good because they resonated with you,
Okay.
and to adapt them. I think that's almost, there are instances where you've got to completely write it from scratch, but that's what I'd say. So if there are companies that you can tell are getting respect and love from journalists, press, and investors alike. It's not that hard. You just go to their news section. You can go and look what they did there. So that's
Yeah.
that's that's the easiest way to do it properly, I'd say.
Okay. Okay. Um, are there any red flags to avoid in ESG press releases?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you got to remember that if you exaggerate what you're doing, and like I said before, there's not enough substance behind it, that's really dangerous. And journalists love to, go after companies who do that. Something I'd throw in here, Nathan. I had an editor at the Wall Street Journal, and he wouldn't let me write a positive story. It was like against the rules. Wouldn't let me.
Wow.
So I think most editors are not quite that extreme, but be careful. Reporters, one of the reasons they take that job, which is not exactly financially lucrative in most cases, is because they like to say, I gotcha, and say that they're changing the world because they see someone who's not communicating in an honest way. So I would just say, stick to what you really have, and don't overblow it, because it could get noticed. And it might not be that you get attacked individually, but you don't want to get wrapped into a big story with 5 other companies, and maybe some of them are doing something worse than you are. So you just got to be careful, because ESG has become a lightning rod. I mean, look at where I am in Florida. I think that our governor here has said very clearly he hates it, right?
Yeah.
It's not my job to really have an opinion on it, Nathan. I hope you and your audience see that. I mean, I'm just
Yes.
telling you what I observe,
Yeah.
which is that it's become politically divided. And another thing to remember is that even the likes of BlackRock, Vanguard, may not even use the term ESG anymore. Larry Fink, who used to write an annual letter and talk all about it, says, "Oh my goodness, I've done something that's become so politicized. I never meant it to be that way." And he's backpedaling a little bit.
Yeah.
So just be careful. Embracing ESG is not going to necessarily win you all friends. You're going to get some enemies.
Yes, of course. Yes. And to follow up with that, uh, do you have any specific no-nos as far as content for a ESG press release?
Um, I think that I think, just like I was saying before, not to be repetitive, Nathan,
Yeah.
but this, what one press release is not going to, solve all your problems. It
Yes.
needs to be part of a program, and spending time in that framework and actually taking it seriously and finding reasons why it works, not just to appease, the side of the investing base that happened to love ESG 2 years ago, maybe still does, maybe doesn't, is not effective. I think that what you should do is think about what's important in your company culture. Like, before you look outward, look inward. Think what's important to us. What do our customers and our employees think are most important? Why do they work here? Why do they buy things from us? And try to shape it around that, rather than saying, oh, Larry Fink said ESG is the bee's knees, so I've just got to say we love ESG. That doesn't work. It needs to be much more customized and tailored.
Okay. Thank you for sharing insights on that. I think that would greatly benefit our listeners. Next, I want to talk about follow-up and timing for press releases. Do you believe that companies should follow up after sending a press release? If so, what's an effective way to follow up and within what time frame?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good idea. You don't want to follow up every time, but if it's something that you think, really, and I wouldn't do it on a blasted basis. If you've got 5,000 reporters, I wouldn't email them all twice. I would go with a more rifle shot approach and say, that reporter, he or she, seems to have written about this topic before, took interest in it, and say, I'd like to be a resource, or I'd like to, get to know you better, that's that sort of thing. So it shouldn't just be hitting resend. It needs to be a little more thoughtful, and
Yes.
humanized. So it looks like it's coming from a real person who spent time to write the email.
Yes, of course. And additionally, is there an optimal day or time for sending a ESG press release?
Well, I would say stay away from Friday afternoons, especially in the
Yes.
summer.
Yep.
I actually find that it's easiest to get people's attention Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. This
Okay.
is not scientific, Nathan, but we, for instance, when we host video events, we shoot for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, because I've just noticed click rates are higher. There's people are more interested on those days. It's Monday's the beginning of the week. Friday, particularly in August, is kind of a wash. So that's what I'd say on that.
Okay, great, great. Let's move along. Considering your role as an editor, how do you prefer companies and organizations to approach you for media coverage related to ESG topics?
Well, I think in my case, if you're thinking of me specifically, and I'm happy you're giving me this opportunity. We have panels and we have our conference in November, and we would welcome either as guests in the audience or possibly as speakers, clients of perhaps some of the folks who are watching this. I would say reach out directly. Say, we saw news about this. I think that our CFO, our CEO could be a great fit there, perhaps to attend or speak on a panel, that sort of thing. So showing that you've actually looked at what we do, with a little bit of care, and seeing that there is an opportunity is helpful. And I'm telling you right now, we still have some room for folks like that.
Yes. Okay. And also, what contact methods do you find most efficient and respectful of your time as an editor?
Well,
Would
I
it
think,
be email or just, I'm sorry.
yeah. So I think so, Nathan. I mean, we all,
Mhm,
we're all happy to do video calls and phone calls sometimes, but
mhm.
if something can be done over email, that's better, because you don't. I mean, you can just be on your phone basically, and you can work with it. So that's what I'd say. But again, I wouldn't want to scare everyone away. Journalists aren't that intimidating. I mean, if sometimes the right thing to do is call and say, look, I think you might be missing something. Can you check those emails I sent? Um,
Yeah,
we're not trying to make you buy anything. We're just trying to see if we might be able to work together. So I
yes,
think that would be the approach.
of course. Thank you. And we're down to my last question for the podcast. Based on your experience as an editor in the ESG field, do you have any last minute recommendations or insights for companies aiming to enhance their media engagement in the ESG domain? And I guess this would be a perfect time to mention whatever you whatever you mentioned earlier in the interview. I
Yeah.
forgot what it was. I forgot to write it down. But yeah, you
No,
can
no, no,
go
no.
ahead
Yeah,
and
no.
mention that as well.
Yeah, Nathan. So what I was going to talk about was the evolution of ESG and considering all stakeholders in a business. I interviewed Martin Lipton, who's a famous Wall Street attorney who pioneered a lot of stuff going back to the '80s and earlier. And I was lucky enough to interview Marty on stage, and what he had to say was that this idea of shareholder primacy, that companies exist for shareholders, is wrong. Governments allow corporations to form, and they do so for the sake of a broader community. And I think that there's some truth to that. But on the other hand, we've seen the rise of anti-ESG, right? So
Yes.
I think that I think you've got to realize that you could actually make enemies pretty easily out
Yeah.
there. If again, going back to Governor DeSantis here, there are a lot of folks who don't like woke investing, right? So if you're doing that, just be very, if you're trying to present yourself as compassionate to ESG, just remember that there's a strong force out there that wants you to be more nuanced. They want you to care about governance, but they don't want you to do, they don't want necessarily for you to get overly excited about the E and the S if it's really
Yes.
not going to help shareholder returns. But I think in the long run, people do believe that the elements of ES and G will help shareholders over time. It's just, it's a little bit of a subtle topic. You can't just say it needs to be implemented on a widespread basis, because it's gotten messy. It's upset some people, and sometimes it hasn't really worked very well. So that's what I'd say is it's an important thing, incredibly important to be aware of and to know how to talk about, but you got to be a little nuanced about it. Explain what it means to your company.
Thank you for sharing that. I do want to ask you one more question. As far as platforms, which platform, I mean, social media platform, I apologize. Which social media platform do you use most often for professional purposes?
That's a great question, Nathan. I was just talking about that with my colleagues. So we find that while we use Twitter and Instagram, even TikTok, LinkedIn seems to be the most powerful, because most
Yes.
of the folks on there are looking for business related content. And what I'll witness is, we'll do an interview. Like we have a partnership with the New York Stock Exchange and we create this beautiful content there. When someone gets one of those files and shares it,
Yes.
their colleagues want to support them. And, there are all kinds of reasons why it gets shared and liked that don't happen on Twitter and Instagram. So that's my top pick. I'm not saying that I don't like the other two, but for us, it just seems to get us far more traction than the others do.
Okay, that was interesting. That was interesting. Well, John, those are all the questions that I have for you today. Thank you for joining me and providing me insights for our listeners. And to all of our listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, please share with your friends and colleagues and comment your thoughts on best practices for pitching at ESG press release. Take care.
Thanks, Nathan.